The Taliban, meaning students in Pashto, emerged from the chaos of Afghanistan's civil war in the early 1990s. They promised order and stability, quickly seizing control of most of the country. Their rule, from 1996 to 2001, was marked by a strict interpretation of Islamic law. This period saw public executions, amputations, and severe restrictions on women. The Taliban also provided sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group responsible for the 9/11 attacks. The United States, in response to 9/11, invaded Afghanistan in 2001. U.S. forces, along with Afghan allies, quickly toppled the Taliban regime. The Taliban retreated, melting away into the rugged mountains along the Afghan-Pakistan border. They were down, but not out. The world watched as Afghanistan began to rebuild after decades of conflict. A new government was formed, backed by the international community. Schools and hospitals were rebuilt. Women regained some basic rights. However, the Taliban's presence cast a long shadow over this fragile peace. The seeds of their resurgence were already being sown. The Taliban, far from defeated, regrouped and reorganized in their mountain hideouts. They exploited local grievances, corruption within the Afghan government, and the weariness of a population longing for peace. The Taliban's insurgency gained momentum, fueled by a steady stream of recruits and support from across the border. They launched a relentless campaign of violence, targeting Afghan security forces, government officials and civilians. Roadside bombs, suicide attacks, and assassinations became commonplace. The Taliban's message was clear: they were here to stay, and they would not be deterred. The United States and its NATO allies poured billions of dollars into training and equipping the Afghan security forces. The goal was to create a force capable of defending the country on its own. However, corruption, poor leadership, and low morale plagued the Afghan army and police. The Taliban exploited these weaknesses, steadily expanding their control in rural areas. As the years dragged on, the conflict in Afghanistan became known as America's longest war. The war in Afghanistan stretched on for 2 decades, spanning 4 U.S. presidencies. The initial military success of ousting the Taliban gave way to a grinding stalemate. The U.S. public grew weary of the seemingly endless conflict, with no clear victory in sight. By 2020, the Trump administration had negotiated a deal with the Taliban. The agreement called for the withdrawal of all U.S. troops in exchange for security guarantees and a commitment from the Taliban to engage in peace talks with the Afghan government. However, the deal was criticized for excluding the Afghan government from the negotiations and for making significant concessions to the Taliban. Despite the risks, the Biden administration decided to honor the agreement and complete the U.S. withdrawal. The stage was set for a dramatic and chaotic turn of events. Section 4. The Fall of Kabul. In the spring of 2021, as the U.S. withdrawal began, the Taliban launched a lightning offensive across Afghanistan. Afghan forces, plagued by low morale and widespread desertions, crumbled in the face of the Taliban's advance. City after city fell to the insurgents, with barely a fight. The speed of the Taliban's advance shocked the world. Within weeks they had reached the outskirts of Kabul, the Afghan capital. The Afghan government, riddled with corruption and infighting, collapsed. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. On August 15, 2021, Taliban fighters entered Kabul, encountering little resistance. The Afghan capital, once a symbol of hope for a new Afghanistan, was now firmly back in the hands of the Taliban. The world watched in disbelief as the country spiraled into chaos. Section 5. A chaotic exodus. The fall of Kabul triggered a mass exodus of Afghans desperate to escape Taliban rule. Thousands of people rushed to Kabul's airport, the only way out of the country. Scenes of utter chaos unfolded, as desperate Afghans, fearing for their lives, thronged the airport's perimeter. Images of people clinging to departing U.S. military planes shocked the world. The desperation was palpable. The United States and its allies struggled to evacuate their own citizens and Afghan allies amid the chaos. The evacuation effort was marred by confusion, delays, and tragedy. A suicide bombing at the airport killed scores of Afghans and 13 U.S. service members. The last U.S. troops left Afghanistan on August 31, 2021, marking the end of America's longest war. The Taliban had returned to power 2 decades after being ousted. Section 6. Life under the Taliban. The Taliban's return to power has had a devastating impact on the lives of ordinary Afghans, particularly women and girls. Despite initial promises of a more moderate rule, the Taliban have imposed a harsh interpretation of Islamic law, much like their previous reign. Women have been stripped of many of their basic rights. They are barred from working most jobs, attending secondary school or university, and traveling without a male guardian. Music, television, and other forms of entertainment have been banned. Public executions and corporal punishment have returned. The Taliban's crackdown on dissent has been swift and brutal. Journalists have been arrested and intimidated. Protests have been met with violence. The international community has condemned the Taliban's human rights abuses, but with little leverage to force change. Afghanistan is now facing a dire humanitarian crisis. The economy has collapsed, foreign aid has been cut off, and millions face starvation. The Taliban's ability to govern and address these challenges remains in doubt. Section 7. An uncertain future. The future of Afghanistan under Taliban rule is uncertain. The country is facing a multitude of challenges, including a humanitarian crisis, economic collapse, and the threat of renewed civil war. The Taliban have struggled to consolidate their grip on power and govern effectively. The international community is grappling with how to engage with the Taliban. Some countries argue for engagement to address the humanitarian crisis and prevent further instability. Others advocate for isolating the Taliban until they improve their human rights record and demonstrate a willingness to govern responsibly. The Afghan people, who have endured decades of conflict and hardship, now face an uncertain future. The international community has a responsibility to provide humanitarian assistance and support the Afghan people's aspirations for a more peaceful and prosperous future. Only time will tell what the future holds for Afghanistan.